Hey there, this is Aaron Huertas. I'm a political communicator by profession, and I've been thinking about doing a podcast for a while. The recent debate over the Harper's letter prompted me to give it a shot because there's a huge disconnect between the discourse and the actual practice of politics among volunteers, professionals, candidates, elected officials, appointed officials, and the people who are actually doing the stuff that affects the policy that has a huge impact on people's lives. So I'm not totally sure what this podcast will involve, but I'd like to use it to do close reads of political arguments, not just the substance of the arguments, but how they actually play out in the real world and how they shift the political landscape. And I'm hoping to bring in some interviews and commentary from people who are doing interesting work in this field as practitioners themselves. And I hope that can inform not just your perspective, but your own volunteerism, your own activism, your own advocacy, and your own political work. So here's my deal. I grew up in a working class town in Jersey. I'm a cishet white dude. I studied political communication in DC as an undergrad, and I spent the bulk of my career working with scientists, including doing anti-censorship work with public employees at federal agencies like the EPA and the CDC. I've also worked a ton with climate researchers, and they've obviously been the target of a ton of political harassment from the fossil fuel industry and from that industry's allies in Congress and at the state level. I've also served as a communications director on the Hill. I ran a field office in Ohio in 2016 to help get out the student vote, and I did a bunch of strategic communications work in 2018 to help volunteers go knock doors in swing districts, which helped flip the House. So, like a lot of people who work in politics, I'm part wonk, I'm part organizer, I'm part communicator, definitely a progressive, definitely on the left, have done a lot of work to build power on the left, have also done bipartisan work, have also been part of negotiations to get some policy passed. And that is pretty reflective of a lot of people's work here in DC. More recently, I spent some time volunteering as a street medic at Black Lives Matter Plaza. That involved treating two people who were injured by police in the June 1st gas and trampling attack outside of Lafayette Park. And the U.S. Park Police even shot me in the hip with a pepper bullet while I was peacefully demonstrating. So you could say I have a stake in debates about free speech, free assembly, and censorship in the United States, and I'm probably as entitled to an informed opinion and a hot take as anybody else in the discourse. So onto the letter, and you should definitely give the Harper's letter a read if you haven't already. There's the substantive argument, and we'll talk about that a bit, but then there's the implicit argument and the sort of false equivalencies in the letter that I think tripped a lot of people up and created some backlash that I don't think the letter organizers were really ready for. So the letter itself makes a few actual arguments. First, it applauds equality and inclusion in the context of the recent protests and demonstrations, some of the largest in U.S. history, which is great. Then it says that censorship from the right is somehow getting matched by censorship on the left. And it lists a few anecdotes to back this up of people in media and politics losing their jobs amid some public disputes. But the letter purposefully does not get into specifics, and it even avoids getting into those specifics. It's an argument by anecdote, and that's a problem. It calls for good faith disagreement and, quote, exposure, argument, and persuasion, rather than silencing or wishing away, close quotes, of competing viewpoints. So it's all fine and dandy at a substantive level. The problems are that the letter equates a sort of general trend that the authors want to assert on the left with, very well-documented cases of right-wing censorship from very powerful people. The letter calls out Donald Trump by name, but it doesn't call out anyone on the left who is allegedly doing, the other side of the coin, silencing stuff. And that's really odd, right? Because Donald Trump is obviously the president of the United States. He's someone who commands a ton of power and has been doing a ton of censorship of scientists in his administration. Someone who has been ordering military and police to go around D.C. and mess with peaceful demonstrators. So there's a big power gap between the people who are getting criticism in this letter, and that false equivalency is obviously misleading and led to a lot of negative reaction to the letter once it was released. And I should also say, it's an odd letter that leaves itself open to a lot of interpretation because it's not written to anyone. It's not calling for any very specific actions. It's a general statement. It's a complaint. It's these 150 plus writers and intellectuals saying, hey, listen to us. We think this is important. But because it lacks that context and it engages in this false equivalency without being very specific, it's not a persuasive letter to me. And the process used to generate the letter, indeed the political activism the organizers have engaged in, it undercuts their own message in a lot of ways. And I think that's worth thinking through too. After the letter was released, folks pushed back on it. More people, myself included, started interrogating how and why the letter came together in the first place. And I should establish I've worked on letters like this with academics, scientists, and bipartisan pairs of policymakers. And when you do a letter like this, it usually has a clear stated purpose, a clear target audience, and a clear ask, and some pretty, easy to understand standards for who is signing on and why. But this letter was a lot more confused, both in its purpose and in who was speaking for the letter and why. So Thomas Chatterton Williams, he's a columnist at Harper's, and he was one of the organizers of the letter. He has also served as the de facto spokesperson for it, and he told Vice, quote, "After realizing the letter would be incomplete by focusing solely on the left, we felt it was necessary to be absolutely clear that Trump is the Chancellor-in-Chief," close quotes. Well, the letter isn't really clear on that, right? Because it draws a false equivalency, and I think that's pretty easy to see from anybody outside the circle of folks who drafted this letter. And it's very funny to me because Trump has political power. He's the president. And people disagreeing with you on Twitter, they don't have that power, right? I think part of the argument the letter is trying to make is that this new power on the left of social media mobbing, is somehow equivalent to presidential power. And it's obviously not. But also stuff like this has been going on forever. This is like one of the oldest disputes in media and politics. If it's not political correctness, it's cancel culture now, right? Instead of complaining about Twitter, it used to be complaints about blogs. Time is a flat circle. Everything old is new again. It's just kind of a snooze fest to do this stuff. And there's this tendency to want to be seen as the reasonable person in the middle who's going to make a reasonable point about all this stuff. And so some very bad things are happening on the right, and you condemn that. And you say, but on the left, we ourselves must also condemn this bad thing that's going on here. And you can do that. That might make you feel good, but what is the purpose of that? What is the point of that? Does it actually accomplish anything? What's the connection between these two things? That often goes unexplored because people at this level are just taking a position that they think is right. They're not actually pushing for something based on that position to change the politics. They just want to say, hey, this is my position. Check out how good it is. And it's like, all right, cool. Yeah, then what, man? So it's also very telling to me that this letter started off as a criticism of the left and then morphed into something that tried to be more centrist, right? That it creates an inconsistency of message and purpose, and it reveals an attempt to calibrate the message in a political way that obscures its actual intent, which is to admonish people on the left for cancel culture-y social media mobbing stuff. So this letter isn't calling on Trump or Republicans to stop censorship. It's calling on some unstated audience to do good faith disagreements, right? And this brings us to the next problem, which is that at least 3 of the signers feel they were misled. And from what I can tell, the recruitment process for this letter was a little sloppy, and that's what led to this. Some folks have said, they were lied to, or they were led along, or whatever. Yeah, that may be the case. I think incompetence and a lack of transparency might be a simpler explanation here. I think the people who were recruiting for the letter, they were tapping into their networks with different messages about what the purpose of the letter was, what the intent of the letter was, who the audience of other signers were going to be, right? And a helpful comparison I saw was to so-called social engineering, which is something you may have heard about from hackers and discussions about identity theft. And it's the idea that you're more likely to comply with a request if it's coming from someone you trust, or if it looks like it's coming from someone you trust, right? So if your peer, who's your buddy, who's recruiting you and is saying, hey, a bunch of people like us are signing on to this letter, well, you understand that in the context of how you all understand and apply these concepts, right? If a bunch of other people then get added onto the letter without your knowledge, who don't have that same shared understanding of these terms and these concepts with you, that's a problem. So again, my own professional experience, to take something that's kind of related to this, there's a contentious topic called academic freedom. And if I saw a bunch of heads of universities talk about academic freedom, the way I would interpret that is, they want researchers to be able to conduct their research free from political interference. Academic freedom is good. I would feel comfortable telling scientists and other people who care about this issue to sign on to such a letter. Now, if that same letter also included some climate deniers, some anti-vaccine people, some people who run, flat earth conspiracy theory channels on YouTube, I say, what, these people, they're probably not into academic freedom in the same way I'm into academic freedom. When they talk about the importance of academic freedom, what they mean is, I would like the freedom to communicate about these issues without you correcting me. That's what they mean by academic freedom. So a couple people shared their recruitment messages online, and they were inconsistent. They didn't account for the fact that these are contentious terms and concepts that can mean different things to different people. So one academic wrote, I'm afraid to say it seems some well-meaning people got played on this one. For what it's worth, I didn't sign on because I couldn't figure out what it was about, and it was more focused on, and I was more focused on the BLM protest that day. And his solicitation starts, Dear Roy, I hope this finds you well. I thought you might be interested in putting your name to a statement I've been asked to help with. It's an open letter arguing for bolder, more meaningful efforts at racial and gender inclusion in journalism, academia, and the arts, and also greater efforts to respect open debate and political differences. And of course, the final letter doesn't necessarily deal with racial and gender inclusion in journalism, academia, and the arts. It just focuses on that respect and open debate stuff, right? So his pitch was not consistent with the final product. Another writer shared his pitch with me. He ultimately did not sign on. He said, this pitch said, we haven't met, but I admire your work. I'm writing because I had a handful of other writers have written a statement prompted by the recent turmoil. We're inspired by and vehemently supportive of the protests and some of the reforms we hope will follow, but we're also very troubled by some of the purges and intolerance that have come alongside. We are trying to get a diverse, in every sense, group of prominent figures to sign. So far, we have, among others, Ayad Akhtar, the playwright, Ann Applebaum, Reginald Dwayne Betts, Randall Kennedy from Harvard Law, Anthony Cromman at Yale Law, Megan Daum, Dexter Filkins, Arlie Hochschild, Shadi Hamid, and dozens more, and then attaches the statement and asks for some feedback. So, at this point, the pitch is coming with, dozens of signers on, not the final 150. There's no mention of some of the more controversial figures who we'll get to later, who may not necessarily share the same open debate values as all the other signers. And, at a basic level, these are just also inconsistent pitches. What is this about? Who is signing on? There's some opacity here in the recruitment process. And I would guess that the organizers just didn't have a good handle on that recruitment process. They were just like, oh yeah, go get some more folks on board, go pitch them to your people. Instead of thinking of it more holistically and, what is the final group of signers I'm aiming toward? How are people going to view this in context? Are all the signers going to actually have the same shared understanding of what these terms and concepts mean once we all get on it together? So the signers were promised that they were speaking out on a series of contested statements based on an understanding of those shared values. Surprise, you get a couple folks sprung on you who don't share your values. Not great. And I want to address this really directly. Who signs on matters. This is very obvious to people who work in advocacy. The message and the messenger combine to create meaning. Big duh in my field. So, if you're starting from this concept that we should only pay attention to the message and the message can only mean one thing, well, then there's no reason to even have a sign-on letter, right? Why have 150 prominent people from diverse backgrounds sign on to a thing if who signs on doesn't actually matter? Of course who signs on matters, right? But context also matters, and that context was denied to some of the signers. And the response the organizers have had to some of the signers who backed off, I think also dramatically undercuts their message and actually reveals some extreme hypocrisies here that make me question their commitment to free inquiry and open debate. So Jennifer Boylan is a New York Times writer. She's also a transgender rights activist. And she wrote on Twitter after the letter was released, quote, I did not know who else had signed that letter. I thought I was endorsing a well-meaning, if vague message against internet shaming. I did know Chomsky, Steinem, and Atwood were in, and I thought good company, close quotes. So let's just look at this like in the most substantive way. Let's pretend we're like lawyers looking at evidence, right? I did not know who else had signed the letter. I thought I was endorsing a well-meaning, if vague message against internet shaming, and she mentioned Chomsky, Steinem, and Atwood. Chomsky, Steinem, and Atwood don't show up in these other pitches, right? So she's getting pitched the letter from another stream of people who are doing recruitment, God knows who. She might have had a problem with some of the signers who are known for spreading misinformation about trans people, and that includes J.K. Rowling, the Harry Potter author. She was one of the last signers to sign on, according to the organizers, so she got sprung on Jennifer Boylan. And it also includes Jesse Singal, and he's gotten into some very nasty disputes with trans women writers and scholars over his writing, including disputes about the accuracy of his work, as well as a dispute that allegedly led to one writer being fired from her job, aka cancel culture, right? So, again, who signs on matters because how they're applying these values matters, right? But when Boylan spoke up, several of the other signers decided to attack and criticize her and assume the worst instead. And instead of assuming responsibility among themselves as other letter signers or among themselves as letter organizers, they just went after her. And bear in mind, these are people who just signed off on a letter that condemned, quote, intolerance of opposing views, close quotes, as well as, quote, a vogue for public shaming, unquote. J.K. Rowling, you're still following me, Jennifer. Be sure to publicly repent of your association with Goody Rowling before unfollowing and volunteer to operate the ducking stool next time as penance. So like British decoder ring, it's all public shaming stuff. Jesse Single wrote, yeah, here it is, the first official apology for signing a statement condemning the climate of conformity, fear, and mutual surveillance that has descended upon public intellectual life. Is it an apology? Yeah, I mean, she's apologizing for confusing people because she didn't know who else was signing on. And like most normal people, we tend to assume that statements are understood in the context of who is making them. Wild, right? The Atlantic writer Yasha Monk, who goes off about this cancel culture stuff all the time, he said Boylan's message illustrated, quote, the way in which the fear of cancellation turns people into cowards and how terrible this is for intellectual honesty, close quotes. So, wow, really, really high stakes there, man. And, calling somebody a coward and questioning their intellectual honesty, I don't know. I think that might be public shaming. I think that might be social media mobbing. I think that might not be good faith, open debate discourse. And then English professor Lucia Martinez Valdivia, she also withdrew from the letter. And she posted her email to whoever recruited her. They're just listed as a Chris and a Stephanie. So again, who knows who the heck they are. She writes, I asked the organizer who reached out to me for a sample of names to confirm that others signing were people who had demonstrated their commitment to that principle, these principles, and was shown the name of good faith actors. I did not ask for a full list of signatories because it seemed that to ask such a thing in the organization of such a project would ultimately prevent the project itself, involving too many people who strongly disagree with one another to ever produce a joint statement. The selective sharing of names was unusual, I thought, but perhaps an understandable strategy in this case. I did not, however, expect to find bad faith actors on that list, people who have selectively turned to the principle of free expression as a shield, while at the same time weaponizing it in attempts to deny those with whom they disagree the same protections they would enjoy. And there's more there, but I thought that was really the key passage as far as the process goes. And, even if you disagree with me, she is an English professor. She has a lot of standing and expertise to, again, point out this obvious fact that message and messenger combine to create meaning. Very obvious to those of us who work in political communication and who work on political advocacy open letters like this. And she doesn't get personal with her letter, but in addition to Rowling and Single, the other person who popped up among the other signers who might be an outlier here is the New York Times editor Bari Weiss. And she's tried to get people fired for their views too, right? Which obviously affects how people view her signing on to a letter about why that's bad. And I should also add, she's spread misinformation about the left's alleged intolerance for free speech. She, in the Times, that got through whatever fact-checking process they were using, and she cited a fake Antifa Twitter account that was supposedly threatening some campus free speech. Turns out the account was fake. They had to correct the thing. But again, I think it's an example of folks who want to position themselves in the middle, always want to overinflate the censoriousness of the left to sort of keep themselves in the middle and make themselves feel like they're the reasonable ones in the room when it comes to talking about censorship, unquote, both sides, unquote. I should also mention that the historian Carrie Greenidge signed off and then said she didn't endorse the letter. Her sister, who's also an author, said that someone else at a professional organization had signed off in her sister's name. Harper's and Williams, one of the letter organizers, shared some correspondence with the Daily Beast that they said backed up their version of events and that Greenidge had proactively signed off on the letter. Let's leave that aside for a second. I'm not sure exactly what happened there, if there was a professional society involved, one way or the other. But this is clearly a screwed up process where a few of the signers felt misled, either intentionally or not. Probably not. It might just be incompetence. You never know. I wanted to interrogate this a little bit because I am someone who has worked on open letters like this. So I asked Thomas Chatterton Williams about his process, how it worked, and how it maybe led to some of these communication problems. And I thought some of his responses were pretty defensive and pretty funny and demonstrated just a lack of experience in this space. So first, he said that anyone who asked to see the whole list of signers would have been shown it. but that no one he brought on, including J.K. Rowling, asked to see a list of signers. And then, of course, that prompts some other questions, right? Who else got recruited and how? How were they told? He denied that anyone was misled. He interpreted that as, something that's always intentional deception. But you can get misled by accident. It's fine. We can all learn from our little process mistakes in politics. So instead of answering my question about how the final list of signers was shared, if with anyone from him, Harper's, whatever, he wrote back, quote, "Are you supposed to write back and bother, say Salman Rushdie every time you score another signature? Would that not be annoying?" Close quotes. Well, maybe. I don't think you have to ping Salman Rushdie every time you get a new signer. You could just share a final list of signers before your letter goes public. Give everybody a chance to look at the final product, right? Does Salman Rushdie want to join a Slack channel where everybody discusses the letter step by step? I don't know. Maybe a Slack channel would have made this process more transparent to everybody. But what I told him, taking his question here at face value, is that usually organizers use simple tools, things like spreadsheets or contact management systems, to track all the signers, to track recruitment, to communicate with signers and update them on the process, right? And then usually, before you do a public release, everybody gets a final copy of the letter and instructions on how and when to promote it, right? They get some talking points to say, hey, here's the link. Hey, it's going to go live at 7 a.m. Eastern. We got a hot letter. We're putting it out in public. And my work has been with advocacy groups that are used to doing this sort of thing. So again, I don't attribute this to people purposely trying to trick people into signing onto the letter. For all I know, that did happen, but I think incompetence might be a simpler explanation here. New America fellow Tawfiq Rahim, he's another signer. He told me that my claims were baseless. He told me that, quote, "no one was misled," close quotes. And that's despite the fact that at least 2 signers clearly said that, yes, they were misled. So don't take it up with me, man. Take it up with them. He also said that the organizers were under no obligation to respond to me. I said that was super true. But of course, what I find interesting is that they're not responding directly to Boylan or Valdivia either. Caitlin Flanagan, another Atlantic writer who signed the letter, she did not respond to Boylan or Valdivia's points when I asked her either. Instead, she responded with a straw man. She wrote, quote, "I'll tell you what I think when you tell me who else thinks it," close quotes. And that's, of course, not what Boylan or Valdivia said. It's a straw man argument. And again, this is very funny to me because these are all people who just signed off on a statement that said, quote, "The way to defeat bad ideas is by exposure, argument, and persuasion, not by trying to silence or wish them away," close quotes. And I would argue that if you don't directly respond to an argument and instead offer up a straw man version of it, that is a form of wishing an argument away. It is a form of not being persuasive to the people making the argument. And this is political, right? The authors are engaging in a political debate, and who they try to persuade, how they try to persuade them, those are all political decisions that involve the power relationship among the people having the conversation. And now that the signers have backed out and say, hey, I'm not on this list of signers anymore, the reaction from some of the letter organizers and defenders and Harper's itself has been super defensive. It's been to punch down at the signers who felt misled. And instead of asking about how they could have had a more transparent process that was better for everyone involved, they decided, oh, this actually proves my point about cancel culture. These people must be afraid of the social media mob. And it's like, no, you presented something in one context when they were recruited by God knows who, and now it's understood in a different context because you put some bad faith people on this thing, right? And some people are fine with that. Noam Chomsky's out there. He's like, yeah, I'm fine with the letter. It's cool, whatever. Chomsky's pretty chill. I think Chomsky probably has more chill, given the fact that he's 91 years old and responds to emails from everybody than a lot of the other folks involved here. Okay, final analysis. Open debate is a wonderful value worth defending, but you need to be able to participate in good faith in open debates. The people who participate in a debate have to be able to develop a shared understanding of what they are debating. And you don't have to agree with the other person, but you do need to be able to understand their frame of reference. You need to be able to understand how they're using words in context. You need to be able to understand what the strongest versions of their arguments are, as well as the weakest versions. If you're just arguing against the weakest versions of their argument, if you're just nibbling around the edges, you're not really engaging in a debate. You're just kind of, you're BSing back and forth, whatever. And that's most political discourse, right? Most political discourse doesn't involve direct argumentation. And that's what we're seeing here. If what you really want is for your own side in a debate to be heard loudly while you dunk on the other side of a debate and make them look like fools, that's a lot more typical for a political debate, right? That's a lot more typical for a propaganda debate, right? It's my crappy message that I'm going to back up with $100 million in spending versus your awesome truth-based message that only has $1 million in spending behind it, right? That's what platforms are. That's what propaganda is. That's all this stuff around the speech and the debate that we don't pay enough attention to, in my opinion, because we're so focused on these sort of idealized visions of what speech or debate could look like. And those idealized visions have never existed. These debates last forever as the media technology and the landscape and the tactics all change around them. So if you're ultimately more invested in promoting and defending your own speech instead of other people's speech, you are not as much of an advocate for free inquiry, for open debate, for liberal values, and for speech as you think you are. And to take Chomsky as a for instance, here's a guy who's been arguing for people who've been getting censored for decades, right? He has the credibility to say whatever the heck he wants about free speech, in my opinion. I think some of the other folks involved don't have that same credibility because they haven't built it through their own actions and through their own advocacy work. And I think they screwed up here, not just in their message, but in how they rolled out the message and in how they involved other people in their political project. So thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed that. In the future, I expect these to be less of a monologue. I can definitely talk. I can talk fast. I'm from Jersey. I got to work on my J.K. Rowling impression. I got to work on my Donald Trump impression, I know. But if you have ideas for other topics you want to tackle, please drop me a note on Patreon or on Twitter. I'm excited to figure out what people are into, how I can help clarify these debates, how I can help people do more effective political work on the causes they care about, and we will just have an immense amount of free inquiry, free speech, and open debate about these topics moving forward. Thank you. So I have a brief addendum to this podcast that I wanted to add. Thomas Chatterton Williams on Monday morning, he posted, this is on Twitter, he's since deleted this, but this is obviously extremely funny. I'm in the middle of nowhere, France, and I literally ended up expelling from my house an American friend of a friend staying over who, out of nowhere, started ranting against Bari Weiss. I asked him to simply substantiate the ridiculous claims he was repeating, and he couldn't. Bari is my friend. People can disagree with her positions, and she'd be the first to encourage that. But what is so incredible is how many don't even know what they are talking about and can't even name a single thing she's written. That was what got them to hold their opinion. This nonsense is seeping into real life. You don't say. People just hear the same people are good or bad and are not thinking or reading for themselves. I think a lot of people are misinterpreting this tweet on purpose. I invited him repeatedly to expound in good faith. He couldn't, and he ended up self-expelling with my encouragement. So the open debate letter organizer couldn't have a constructive conversation with a house guest about stuff that is immediately relevant to the letter. And everybody was dunking on the guy, and I think for very good reason. And this also sort of backs up my thesis, right? If you're not used to actually having good faith political arguments, it's really hard to have them. If you think a good faith debate is when people adopt your frame of reference and respond to every point that you want to make, you're really not going to have a great time in political debates, right? You actually have to take the time to understand people's frame of reference, even if you have no hope of ever persuading them, even if they're just completely alien to you ideologically. And if it's in the context of a house guest, like you just don't have to have the argument, man. Like you just don't have to go there. You can just say like, well, I respectfully disagree. Let's I don't know, stare at a sunset and drink some wine or whatever it is you do in France. And then Williams was canceled by his wife. Cancel culture has infected the Williams household. He wrote, I didn't want to delete it, but my wife made me delete it. Twitter is a toxin. That's the moral of this story. So this is great. And some other letter signers, including Jesse Singal, went this direction too after they had... what some people call Twitter meltdowns, but I think I would just call like hypocritical self-owns and being a little too intense about this stuff. And it's to blame Twitter and to blame the medium. And again, as with the letter, like the blame is always external. It's always the format's fault. It's always the publication's fault. It's always somebody else's fault. The signers who signed off on the thing who didn't want to sign off on, it turns out it was their fault. It couldn't possibly be me who organized this poorly. It couldn't possibly be me who didn't de-escalate my conversation with my house guest. And then finally, God bless the wife here. Thank you, Antifa super soldier William's wife, for censoring his free speech and getting him to delete his Twitter thread. And like, seriously, I don't want to pick on the guy. I think he just hasn't engaged with stuff like this before in a deep level, or thought about, how these things play out politically or how people interpret them. It's fine. So I'll stop making fun now, but like, what a great coda. What a great coda to the letter story. People have been emailing Noam Chomsky for the past couple of days with their takes about the letter to like try to get Noam Chomsky to validate it. And I think take a screen cap of the Williams tweets and email them to Chomsky and just say, Noam, what do you do when you disagree with a house guest, man? How does that go down? And he might have some tips for us. He's 91 years old. He's been through a lot of really intense public debates. I'm curious to see what Chomsky thinks about all that. Cancel culture, folks. Don't let it creep into your homes. Let it stay on Twitter.com. Let it stay on the hell site. Take care of yourselves. Bye.